In several comments on other videos, I was asked if I could do a breakdown of the Chronic leftover tracks, and that's exactly what we're gonna cover in this video. It was the album that introduced artists such as Snoop, Dez, Kurupt, RBX and the Lady of Rage to the world. The record is an absolute classic and it makes sure that the G-Funk sound in combination with the gangsta rap became very popular. We'll do a breakdown of 12 leftover tracks that were recorded during the Chronic sessions but didn't make it on the final release. But before we do the breakdown of the leftover tracks, we will first cover some more background information and we will discuss the following topics in this video. First, we will briefly discuss some figures and results that were achieved after the release of the Chronic. Then we'll go deeper into how the album came about and how Dr. Dre made the transition from Ruthless to Death Row, where initially the relationship was still good between Eazy and Dre when Dre started his own label. We will also delve deeper into the original plans that Dre had for his first solo album, which was that he initially planned to only produce and not rap on it himself. We will also cover which producers worked on the Chronic, because it wasn't all Dr. Dre, and we'll also cover the samples that Warren G brought that were used for several songs on the album. After that, we will do a breakdown of the timeline of the first draft of the track list and how it evolved into the final track list as it was released on the album. We'll also cover a demo tape for the Chronic, and on the demo tape some tracks are different from the versions as they were released on the album, so we'll cover that. After that, we'll go more into detail on the Chronic tour and why it was cancelled after just 7 shows, and we will also discuss how Dr. Dre himself now looks back at the Chronic and the whole era that it was created. And in the final part of the video, we will do a breakdown of 12 leftover tracks, which also includes demos and alternate versions that were recorded during the recording sessions of the Chronic. So make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Any additional information or other interesting things to share about the Chronic, make sure to drop a comment below. And if you like these type of videos, make sure to check out the other videos on the channel as well. And with that being said, now let's dive straight into the topics of this video. And the official release date of the Chronic was December the 15th in 1992. And after its release, the Chronic reached number 3 on the Billboard 200 charts, and it has been certified triple platinum with sales of more than 3 million copies in the United States, making Dre one of the top 10 best-selling American performing artists of 1993. The Chronic spent 8 months in the Billboard top 10, and the album's 3 singles became top 10 Billboard singles. And the first single was Nothing But a G-Thang, and it was released on January the 19th in 1993. And it reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the Hot Rap Singles and Hot R&B Singles charts. The next track from the Chronic that was released as a single is Dre Day, and this was released on May the 20th in 1993. And the third single is Let Me Ride, and this one was released on September the 13th, also in 1993. And the response was generally very positive. And in an article of the Source magazine that was published in 1993, they wrote, and here's a part of the article: following the hype behind one of the hardest tracks ever, Deep Cover, Dre has unloaded all over this album with the same verified intensity, cuts like Nothing But a G-Thang, These Nuts, and Beats Ain't Shh, back enough bottom to blow the frame out of a Pathfinder, while the live keyboards coat the high ends with funky melodies. The result is that patented smooth gangsta groove combined with the flavor of the classic Funketeers, an original flavor both musically and lyrically that rises well above a retread of gangsta cliches or overused samples. And the Chronic received a rating of 4.5 out of 5 in this article from the Source magazine. And of course, it is common knowledge that the album became a huge success. And the Chronic was Dr. Dre's first album released after leaving the group NWA and Ruthless Records. And the reason for this was that Dre was unhappy with Ruthless Records over money disputes. And what happened was that Dr. Dre and Eazy-E had a conversation, and the outcome was that Eazy-E actually had to choose between working with Dr. Dre or Jerry Heller. And eventually Eazy-E chose to go with Jerry Heller, and that's why Dre wanted to leave Ruthless Records. But that was not easy because he was still under contract. So during the time that NWA worked on their N for Life album, Eazy-E tried to keep Dre happy by letting him operate under his own label. And initially, the relationship between Dre and Eazy was still quite good when Dre decided to go solo. And in an interview Dre did around this time, he said this, quote, "A lot of rumors going around about the group breaking up and everything. That's not happening. We're still a part of NWA. NWA is still together. I just had to move aside for a minute and do my own thing. Make a little bit of Dre's money. Ray's doing his own solo thing and everybody's going to get paid." End quote. And by that time, MC Ren had also gone solo, and there was no reason for beef or whatsoever, so that's why Dre mentioned that in the interview he did. And the first name that Dre had in mind for his own label was Future Shock, and this was later changed to Death Row. One of the first albums planned to be released was by the trio Paul Broken Lonely, which consisted of the members Chris the Glove Taylor, Michael Lynn and Ruben Cruz. And by the way, Chris the Glove Taylor also played a role in the mixing and producing of the Chronic album, but more about that comes up later in this video. And the whole clash between Eazy and Dre happened when Dre hooked up with Suge Knight and he got involved. And supposedly Suge used some aggressive methods to get Dr. Dre, DOC and Michel'le out of their contracts with Ruthless, and that resulted in Eazy-E filing a lawsuit. And Eazy issued a statement that he was forced and menaced into signing a form releasing them from Ruthless Records. And this resulted in Dre having to fulfill his contractual obligations, and therefore he had to help above the law with a song for the album Black Mafia Life, and he also had to turn in one R&B album, which was the album titled No Money No Honey by Paul Broken Lonely. And this led up to one of the first visible cracks between Dr. Dre and Eazy-E that became visible on the prelude of the album No Money No Honey. Dre can be heard on the prelude and he said this: "Check this out, this is Dr. Dre from the world's most dangerous group, and I'm here to introduce you to the newest members of the family." And it was quite obviously that at the bleep part he said Death Row. So Dre actually said Death Row family, but later Eazy-E decided to edit the Death Row part out of the prelude. So after Dre went solo, he planned on working on his first solo album after leaving NWA. And the original title of the album was called Overdose. And this was confirmed by Dr. Dre in an interview he did. And he did this interview at the Death Row Records launch party in '92. And in this interview Dr. Dre said this, quote, "What I'm doing right now is I'll be putting out a solo album soon, Overdose. It'll be out maybe by the end of May, and it's going to be a hit," end quote. And in another interview Dre did years later after the Chronic had been long released, he mentioned that the initial idea was that he would only produce the album and not rap on it himself. And it was actually Dr. Dre's friend the DOC who talked him into doing both rapping and producing for his album. And this was confirmed by Dre in an interview, and he said this, quote, "The DOC, my friend, talked me into getting on the mic and actually doing that thing. And before that, I wasn't gonna get on the mic. I was just gonna lay back and produce, which was the idea of the Chronic album, my first solo album. That's what I wanted to do," end quote. So if the DOC hadn't convinced Dr. Dre to also rap on his album, classic songs like Nothing But a G-Thing, Dre Day, Let Me Ride and others probably would never have been made, or at least not with Dr. Dre on it. And it's actually the chemistry between Dr. Dre and Snoop that make these songs so good. So we gotta thank the DOC for that. And in an article of the Source magazine that was published in February of '93, they wrote this about the chemistry between Dre and Snoop and the Chronic album. "Dre exchanges rhymes with Snoop like he used to with Ren, and you get the feeling that they're in perfect sync. Plus, Dre had established a whole crew of new MCs to catch wreck, including Kurupt, Dez, RBX, and a powerful new female named Rage. All five of them come together for one of the hardest cuts on the LP, Stranded on Death Row. And has often been confirmed in various interviews, the DOC and Snoop had an important role in writing the lyrics used for the songs on the Chronic, and also other artists like Dez and Kurupt that were featured on the album also wrote lyrics for the songs on the Chronic. And as far as producing, the Chronic was also a collaboration, and certainly not all Dr. Dre. Besides Dr. Dre, other musicians that worked on the Chronic were Dez, Justin Reinhardt, Eric Borders, Colin Wolfe, Sharon Moore, Katis Buckingham, and Chris Claremont. The album was mixed by Dr. Dre and Chris the Glove Taylor, who was also part of the group Paul Broken Lonely, and Greg Royal was the mix engineer. And a fun fact is that Warren G actually made the demos to Let Me Ride, Lil Ghetto Boy, and These Nuts. And it was Dez who made the demos to High Powered and Rat-Tat-Tat, and that's the version that was released on the album, because there's also a demo version of Rat-Tat-Tat, and that one was made by Warren G. And Warren G was also the person who brought in the samples for tracks like Nothing But a G-Thing, Stranded on Death Row, and Little Ghetto Boy. And Snoop also mentioned in an interview that Warren G brought the sample for Little Ghetto Boy, and he said, quote, "Warren G brought in the Donny Hathaway, Little Ghetto Boy laying in the ghetto streets, and Dre flipped it like, hold on, give me that, took that mother F and made it a straight hit," end quote. In an interview, Warren G also explained who was involved in the Chronic, and he said this, quote, "As far as on the Chronic, I'm not trying to take no credit away from nobody. I was involved in the Chronic, Dez was involved in the Chronic, Chris Glove was involved in the Chronic, Dr. Dre was involved in the Chronic, all of us producers together as one. But Dre is a genius. I'll never try and take no credit away from Dr. Dre, but we did help out on the Chronic with Dre. The dude is a genius. End quote. And Warren G also said that he loved the whole experience of working on the Chronic, but afterwards he wished he was more business minded back then because he didn't get a penny for his efforts. And Chris the Glove Taylor, who was also part of the group Po Broke and Lonely, as I already mentioned earlier in this video, also spoke out in an interview about his contributions to the Chronic. And in an interview he was asked if he did any production or co-production on the Chronic, and he said this, quote, "Yes, I produced a song called Stranded on Death Row. That was me and Dre. There's been a long-standing rumor that I did everything and Dre did nothing. That's not true. You will never hear me say that, but I also did a hell of a lot that I never received credit for." End quote. The interviewer then asked him what he never received credits for, and Chris the Glove said this, quote, "The Chronic not so much because I mixed it with him and it was all going good at that point. Although I never got credit for producing Stranded on Death Row, and that's where the F-up started. I thought maybe it was a mistake or an oversight at the time, so we go on to Snoop's album Doggy Style and I work with Dre hand in hand for about 70% of that album, and I mix more of that record than the Chronic." End quote. Now some of the tracks that were recorded during the early recording sessions for the Chronic were the original version of OG to BG featuring Dr. Dre and Snoop, also Die Mother Effer Die and Mr. Officer featuring RBX, Prince Idol Joe and Snoop, and also Lady Levi can be heard on the track. And the track Ho Hopper featuring Dr. Dre and Snoop was also recorded during the early Chronic sessions. And I will do a more in-depth breakdown of those tracks later in this video, but those tracks were not included in the first tracklist draft for the Chronic. And here you can see an image of the first tracklist draft. You can see that the tracklist was almost the same as the final version of the tracklist for the Chronic, but the difference between the first draft tracklist and the final tracklist is that the track 187'em was scrapped, and instead of 187'em they added Bees Ain't Shh to the tracklist. And here you can also see an email confirming this, and it says, "Per our conversation today, here are the changes that will be made on the Dr. Dre album. Replacing 187'em will be Bees Ain't Shh, written by Dr. Dre, Colin Wolf, Snoop, DOC, Kurupt, and Daz. Additional vocals by Snoop, Daz, and Kurupt. Attached is a copy of the changes Kim Holt made. Thanks." And before the Chronic was officially released, there was also a promo tape available, and that promo tape also had the song 187'em on it, and the track Bees Ain't Shh was not yet added to it. And the reason it was decided to scrap the 187'em track, and I also explained this in the previous video, which was the deep cover breakdown, but the reason for scrapping the track was that Ice-T's track Cop Killer Controversy was killing a lot of record deals around that time. And also the fallout from the metal band Body Count prevented it, and basically Dre and Suge didn't want to lose no deals over that, and therefore it was decided to completely scrap the 187'em track from the Chronic. And another thing to mention about the promo tape is that 2 tracks on it are slightly different from the versions that were released on the final album. And those tracks are Little Ghetto Boy and Stranded on Death Row. And on the promo tape, the first verses on Little Ghetto Boy from Dre and Snoop has a few words changed in it. And the second verse from Snoop has a lot of different lyrics compared to the version that was released on the official Chronic album. And also on the track Stranded on Death Row, there's something different from the version that was released on the promo tape compared to the version that was released on the Chronic album. And they basically changed one line in Snoop's verse. And on the original version that was on the promo tape, Snoop says, "Making videos, now I stay in Hollywood. Killing cops for a living, now they call me Eastwood." And on the final version that was released on the Chronic, the lyrics were changed to "Making videos, now I stay in Hollywood. Busting raps for my snaps, now they call me Eastwood." It is likely that this line from Snoop was changed for the same reason as that 187'em was deleted, and that is that the line was controversial because it was about killing cops, and Dre and Suge wanted to avoid that because they didn't want to lose no deals over that. And if you want to see an in-depth breakdown of the deep cover track and also the 187'em remix, you should check out the previous video on the channel, because in that video I did a breakdown of the 3 versions of deep cover and also 2 other tracks that are related to the deep cover song. But back to the involvement of the Chronic tracklist draft, and over here you can see an image of a document file that shows that Bees Ain't Shh first was intended to be the 7th song on the album, but right before the Chronic was released on the 15th of December in '92, it was decided that Bees Ain't Shh would be the 16th song on the album, and it was listed after the Chronic outro, so it basically became a bonus track instead of the 7th track on the album. Another thing that you may have noticed is that on the first release of the Chronic, the front cover is slightly different from the cover that was released on later versions. And on the screen you can see both covers displayed next to each other, and you see on the left the original front cover, and on the right you can see the front cover that was released later, and the difference is that on the bottom left you can see that the artists are mentioned that are featured on the Chronic. You can see it says featuring the Death Row inmates, and the first name is Snoop Dogg, the second name is the DOC, and those two names are displayed larger as the other names, which are Kurupt, Jewel, Dez, Rage and RBX. After the Chronic album was released, there was also a Chronic tour planned, and here you can see an image of a ticket for the Chronic tour, and as stated on the tickets, several artists were part of the tour, including Dr. Dre, Snoop, The Dogg Pound, Run DMC, Onyx and Boss. Unfortunately, there's little to no video footage available online of the Chronic tour, and it also has to do with the fact that the tour was cancelled after just 7 shows. An LA Times article published on September 23rd in '93 stated this: "The viability of rap music concerts is being questioned again, with the news Wednesday that Dr. Dre's highly touted tour has been indefinitely postponed." The tour, which featured performances by some of the hottest rappers in the business, including Dre's controversial sidekick Snoop Doggy Dogg, was shut down after just 7 shows, primarily due to promotion problems, sources said Wednesday. Another part in the article stated this: "There was, however, no violence at the Dre shows, which also featured rap acts Run DMC, Onyx and Boss. The plug was pulled on the tour, however, shortly after an encounter last week with police in Milwaukee in which 5 members of the tour entourage were questioned about an alleged vehicle jacking and accounts that they had been brandishing firearms. No one was arrested. And most likely the main reason that the tour was cancelled was because of Snoop's murder case." And in another part of the article it stated this: "Snoop, whose real name is Kelvin Brodus, is due to be arraigned October 1st in West Los Angeles Municipal Court on 1 count of murder, including a special allegation of use of a firearm. Snoop did not pull the trigger, but was charged because he was allegedly driving the Jeep from which the shots were fired by his bodyguard." So unfortunately, the Chronic tour was cancelled after just 7 shows. Before we go over to the breakdown of the leftover tracks, I only want to cover how Dr. Dre himself now looks back on the Chronic, because many people consider it a classic album or perhaps the most iconic rap album in history. But Dre actually said in an interview that he doesn't listen to the Chronic album anymore, and he also doesn't like to be reminded of the era in which the Chronic was created. And in an interview Dre said this, quote, "That particular record," and he was of course referring to the Chronic, "I would say the toughest record I recorded in my career. It was right after my separation with Ruthless and I was in survival mode. And you know, going from that to the organization that I went to, all the things that were happening in the studio during the making, it was crazy. During that process my house burned down, I was shot in the leg, and I was in the studio on crutches for a couple of weeks. So it was a lot that went into that record. It was blood, sweat and beers that went into it." And yes, he actually said beers, so that was a funny comment Dre made, and he also said, "That's one of those records that I don't even listen to anymore. I just don't really like being taken back to that era." End quote. And I think it's actually quite sad that Dre himself doesn't like to be reminded of the album, because it's truly a classic. And when I was doing my research for this video, I've listened to the album a couple of times, and I must say, the more you listen to it, the better it gets. And I also want to share a funny quote from the article The Source magazine that was published in '92, and Dre was asked if he could describe himself, and he said, quote, "I'm a mother effing calm, laid back mother effer. I don't talk that much around people that I don't really know. I like eating mother effing hamburgers, a laid back, down to earth mother effer. That's it. I like kicking it with my homies, just chilling, just having a good time." End quote. And I think it's really good to see how Dr. Dre has matured over the years and developed himself into a legend in the rap game, and also as a businessman with his Beats by Dre headphones and all the stuff he's doing. And instead of eating mother effing hamburgers, Dr. Dre also adopted other routines such as exercising and eating healthy, and he definitely put on some muscle. So now that we have covered the background information about the Chronic, now let's move on to the breakdown of the leftover tracks. And these are the tracks that were recorded during the Chronic sessions, but for different reasons were not released on the final album. And first I want to briefly cover the track 187. I already explained it in the video how that went down and why it was scrapped, but I want to add just one more thing, and that is that on some of the released singles for the Let Me Ride track, 187 was also included, and you can hear Little Ghetto Boy fading out because it was taken from the original version of the Chronic album, and that was supposed to be the next song after 187. So if you have ever noticed that, now you know the reason. And the second track that was also recorded during the Chronic sessions is titled It's On, featuring Snoop and Rage. I've already covered this track in the previous video, which is the deep cover breakdown video. And in that video I did a breakdown of 3 different versions of deep cover. And I also did a breakdown of 2 other tracks that are connected to the deep cover track. and one of those tracks is titled It's On, featuring Snoop and Rage. Sometimes it's also referred to as Deep Cover 2, Kill Another Cop, and this track was recorded during the Chronic sessions but was never intended for the Chronic album, but it was intended for the Deep Cover soundtrack, on which the track Deep Cover also appeared on. But unfortunately, It's On was scrapped from the Deep Cover soundtrack, so it remained unreleased, but you can find a low quality version online, also on YouTube. And on that record, Snoop also uses some of the same lyrics that Dr. Dre used for 187 and Snoop also used some lyrics from his third verse of the unreleased track Gangsta's Life. And in the second half of the song, the beat switches up and you can hear the same beat that was also used for the original version of Rat-tat-tat-tat, or at least a very similar beat with the same sample that was brought by Warren G. And I will cover Rat-tat-tat-tat in just a few seconds. But first I want to cover the next track, and that is Mr. Officer, and that's the original version of the track The Day the Ends Took Over, which appeared on the Chronic. And Mr. Officer is a track by Dr. Dre, RBX, Prince Idol Joe, Snoop and Lady Levi. And this track was intended for the Chronic, but it was scrapped at an early stage and it evolved into the track The Day the Ends Took Over. And Prince Idol Joe and Lady Levi were artists with a reggae background, and if you want to know more about Prince Idol Joe, you can also check out the biography video I did about him on the channel. And perhaps Lady Levi may sound less familiar to you. She was the female reggae artist who can also be heard on the intro of Let Me Ride after Snoop says Biatch. And Lady Levi also can be heard on the track Heavy in the Game featuring Tupac, and also on 2 tracks from Warren G's first album, So Many Ways and I Shot the Sheriff. And on the track Mr. Officer, Dre used a lot of lyrics that he also used for the track The Day the End Took Over. The beat for Mr. Officer was created by Warren G, and for the intro of the track, some samples were used from the movie Men at Work. And most likely the reason that Mr. Officer didn't make it onto the Chronic album was because of the same reason that 187 was scrapped and the original line for Stranded on Death Row was changed, and that's because it was about killing police officers. So now let's go over to the next track on our list, and that's Ho Hopper featuring Dr. Dre and Snoop, and this demo was also recorded during the Chronic sessions. And the beat was produced by Dr. Dre. And actually this track was more recorded for fun and was played during house parties and was never really intended for the Chronic album. So it was a demo from the Chronic sessions and supposedly it was never properly mixed down. A little fun fact is that Dr. Dre's verses on Ho Hopper were written by Snoop, and because the Ho Hopper track was never released, Snoop later used some of the same lyrics on the track Big Pimpin', which was released on the soundtrack for Above the Rim in '94. A verse from Dr. Dre from the Ho Hopper track was later also used for the track titled Ho Hoppin', which is very similar to the title of the original track, and this track was intended for the Chronic 2000 album. And in the period around 98 till 2000, the Death Row roster consisted mainly of some DPG members and Danny Boy, Jewel, and newly signed artists who were unknown to the general public such as The Realist, YGD the Top Dog, Doobie and VK. And the idea was to remix some of the original tracks from Dr. Dre that he did when he was on Death Row, and remix those tracks and add the newer artists from Death Row to promote them. So they took a verse from Dr. Dre from the original Ho Hopper track, they created a new beat and added the verse from Dr. Dre on that beat, and 2 artists from the new roster, YGD the Top Dog and Doobie, also recorded verses for that track, and the chorus was done by YGD and almost used exactly the same lyrics as Snoop did on the original version of Ho Hopper. Eventually, this track was not released on the Chronic 2000 due to legal issues with Dr. Dre, but years later it leaked online and you can find it on YouTube. The next track that was recorded during the Chronic sessions that we will cover in this video is the demo version of Rat-tat-tat-tat featuring Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, and this demo version evolved into the Rat-tat-tat-tat version that was released on the Chronic, and the demo version was made by Warren G, and he later used the same sample for his track And You Don't Stop that was released on his album Regulate G-Funk Era in '94. So that explains why the beats on that songs are very similar. There's also another unreleased remix of Rat-tat-tat-tat, and that was intended for the Chronic 2000. And it's basically the same story as the Ho Hopping track, so they took an original track from Dr. Dre that was unreleased, they took the vocals and put it on a new beat, and they added an artist from the new roster from Death Row on that track. And for this track they added the female rapper VK, and I must say she did a great job on this track, I can dig it. And for this remix they used 1 verse from Dr. Dre from the original track, they also used Snoop's vocals for the chorus, and they added 2 verses from VK. And due to the same legal issues with Dr. Dre, they couldn't use this remix for the Chronic 2000 album, so therefore the vocals from Dr. Dre and Snoop were taken off the track and they added Tretch, another rapper, and this track was the first track on the Chronic 2000 album, the intro. It's a very dope beat, check it out, and also make sure to check out the remix version with the Dr. Dre and Snoop vocals. Now let's go over to the next track on our list that was also recorded during the Chronic sessions, and that's the track Die Mother Ever Die. The beat was produced by Dr. Dre, and there are some rumors that Snoop Doggy Dogg was also supposed to be part of that song, but then it was not used for the Chronic. And years later, they also used this track to create a remix for the Chronic 2000 compilation, and on that version you can also hear the rapper YGD the Top Dog. And the beat on that track has the typical Dr. Dre sound, so it wouldn't surprise me if they have used the original beat that Dr. Dre created for this track and they just added the vocals from YGD the Top Dog on that beat. And there are also some rumors online that Dr. Dre only recorded 2 verses for the original Die Mother Ever Die, and it could certainly be the case because on the remix with YGD you can also hear 2 verses from Dr. Dre. The next track on our list that was recorded during the early Chronic sessions is OG to BG featuring Dr. Dre and Snoop. And on this track Snoop didn't do any verses, but he does some backup vocals for Dre, and for the beat a sample was used from the song Eleanor Rigby by the Nightliners. And this is a leftover track from the early Chronic sessions that didn't make the final cut for the album. A remix version of this track that sounds very similar was later released on the Chronic 2000 compilation titled OG to BG, so it had the same title, and this track featured Superfly and the Dog Pound. The beat is very similar to the beat of the original version, but the version that was released on the Chronic 2000 is a little bit more polished, and they have added a few things to the beat because the original version was kind of a rough draft. And another thing that is different on the version that appeared on the Chronic 2000 is that on the chorus they changed the vocal samples that were used and they replaced it with vocals from Snoop Dogg from the song OG featuring Nate Dogg that was released on the Lost Sessions album, where Snoop says a G is an overseer, the overseer sees, and they took that sample from Snoop and added that to the chorus that appeared on the Chronic 2000. And for the remix on the Chronic 2000 they also used the flow and the verses from Dr. Dre. They changed a few words here and there, but they kept almost everything the same as it was on the original version from Dr. Dre. According to some rumors, there's also a version from OG to BG featuring the Dog Pound and the Realist. This version have never been leaked, so I don't know if it's true or not, but it could definitely be the case that they also did a remix with the Realist for OG to BG, just like they did with the tracks Ho Hoppin' and Rat Tat 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 and Die Mother Ever Die, to promote the newer artists that were on the roster back then. So who knows, maybe we'll get to hear that one day in the future. Now let's move on to the next track on our list, and that's the alternate versions of the classic track Nothing But a G-Tang. And it was mentioned in a couple of interviews, but the version that was released on the Chronic with the classic beat that everybody knows was not the original beat for Nothing But a G-Tang that Snoop wrote the lyrics to. And according to interviews, the first beat was made with a sample of the track I've Been Watching You by the Southside Movement. And this sample has been used in other rap songs as well. For example, Brother Lin Chang used it on the track 24 Deep. And also the track Payback by the Brown Side used a sample of that song. And Snoop said in an interview that Dre played this beat for him when he was in jail with this sample, and he asked Snoop if he could rap over it. This version was never leaked, but you can find several fan-made remixes online where they took the vocals from Nothing But a G-Tang and they added it to the beat with the I've Been Watching You sample. Online you can also find another version of Nothing But a G-Tang with a whole different beat, and it has the same vocals that were also used for the version that was released on the Chronic. And another fun fact is that Dr. Dre also used the beat for Nothing But a G-Tang as it was on the Chronic. He used the same beat, the classic beat, for another track titled Sexual Harassment. This is also known as Nothing But a G-Tang, the jam version. The beat is almost exactly the same, only the bass line is a little bit different. And I don't know who the female singer is that was on the song. It doesn't sound like Jewel or Michelet. According to some comments that I saw online, it could be the female singer that was on Doggy Dogg World, but I don't know if that's true or not, so if you have any more information about that, share it in the comments below. And another fun fact about Nothing But a G-Tang is that there's also a club mix version that was released on the Nothing But a G-Tang single. And this version has the same beat as the track Peace Ain't Shh that was the 16th track on the Chronic. And that beat was also used for the Nothing But a G-Tang freestyle remix that can also be heard on the G-Tang single. And on this track Snoop has a line that was censored and he says, Al Capone was a hero of mine, I shot plenty of ants and cops, so F one time. And I think you can guess it already, but they censored the word cop, so you cannot hear him saying cop on that track. And of course this was done for the same reason why they also scrapped the track 187'em. And Snoop also used the same line on the track Falling Asleep on Death Row that was released on the Lost Sessions in 2009. And according to some sources, Falling Asleep on Death Row was also recorded during the Chronic sessions, but I don't know if that's true or not because some other sources say that it was recorded during the Doggy Style sessions, though I don't know what's true or not. So if you got any more information about that, make sure to drop a comment below. And on the track Falling Asleep on Death Row, they have not edited the cop part out, so that version is uncensored. The next track is the original version of Stranded on Death Row. I already covered it in the video, so I won't go too much in detail about that. But as mentioned on the original version, Snoop has another line and he says, "Killing cops for a living instead of busting raps for my snaps." Next track on the list is Lil Ghetto Boy, the original version. I already covered this one in the video as well, so I won't go too much in detail about that. But the difference on this version is that on the second verse from Snoop, he used some other lyrics. So if you are not familiar with that version yet, make sure to check it out because it's off the chain. And the last track on our list that was supposedly also recorded during the Chronic sessions is Playing for Keeps by Snoop Doggy Dogg and Big Mike and Trey Deuce from the Convicts. And the Convicts were supposed to be signed to Death Row Records around 1992, but it never happened. However, a few tracks were recorded during this period, and one of them is Playing for Keeps, and the beat was produced by Warren G, and he used a sample from the track Scorpio by Dennis Coffey, if I pronounced it correctly. And I would also like to clarify a misunderstanding, and that is that the track Puffin' on Blunts and Tanqueray, or also known as Puffin' on Blunts and Drinking Tanqueray, was recorded after the Chronic was released. And sometimes it is thought that this was also recorded during the Chronic sessions, but that was not the case. But it was recorded shortly after. It's also a dope track. It was produced by Chris the Glove Taylor, who also produced Stranded on Death Row and Dr. Dre, and it was co-produced by DJ Jam. So let me know what your favorite track is from the Chronic sessions and also from the Chronic album. You can drop a comment below. I would go for Die Mother Ever Die or OG to BG, I think, from the leftover tracks. And for the tracks that were released on the Chronic, I would go with, I think, Stranded on Death Row. If you have any additional information about the Chronic or the leftover tracks, make sure to drop a comment below. And if you want to support this channel, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell if you want to stay up to date on the newest videos. And if you are interested in Death Row related stories and breakdowns, also make sure to check out the other videos on the channel as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you back again in the next one.